Now, if you have watched the Olympic Games in Pyeongchang, South Korea, were some of you watching that, right? I mean, they're wrapped up now at this point. But if you watch those games, you may have seen Kelly Clark, who is an American snowboarder. And she's not only an amazing snowboarder, Kelly Clark is also a Christian. And she's been very vocal in speaking about her faith. In fact, you can kind of see it there, but at the very top of her snowboard, it reads, "Jesus, I cannot hide my love." Now, it was not always this way for Clark. She came to faith through another snowboarder who introduced her to Jesus, and Clark saw that other snowboarder wipe out hard. And the other snowboarder was in a competition, and she bit it. And a friend of that other person came up and consoled her after she had wiped out and said, "It's all right. You don't need to cry. God still loves you." And Clark heard this, and it stuck in her mind. And even though Clark was on a winning streak and she continues to have amazing success on the slopes, she was at a point in her life where she wanted something more. She had tasted the sweetness of success, and she knew that it was fleeting. And this is what she says: "In all those external successes, I was really looking for that sense of significance." And that night, after she saw that snowboarder wipe out, she dug the Bible out of her hotel room dresser drawer, but she picks up this Bible, and she realizes she has no idea where to begin, how to read it. And so she goes down the hallway in her hotel, finds where that other snowboarder was at, knocks on the door, and says, "I think you might be a Christian, and I think you might need to tell me about God." It was this turning point in her life. But here's this young person at the top of her game, somebody who had everything going for her, somebody who could expect to continue to rack up what would be counted as success by pretty much every measure, and still she was looking for more. She was hungry for something that went deeper than her gold medal. And you know, the Olympics, when we see the Olympics, it's the athletes, they're all going for gold. Their coaches train them, encourage them, go for gold. Their fans and countries cheer them on, go for gold. Their whole lives, their whole purpose, their whole focus becomes this striving after success. And for them, success is pretty easy to define. It's winning the gold. It's getting that medal. They travel halfway around the world and they win or they lose, they fail or they succeed, but it's pretty easy to see what success looks like for them. You go for gold, and if you come home with gold around your neck, hey, that's success. However, most of life is not like that. And especially when we're talking about the life of following Jesus, about our life together in the church, success is a very tricky word. And I think one of the key steps that we have to make in order to really grow as disciples of Jesus is to learn to die to success. You know, we're talking about death during the season of Lent. Not so much physical death, but the ways that as disciples of Jesus, we learn to die, how that plays out in our lives. And I think we have to learn to die to success. And like Clark, I think we will start to choose significance over success, and we'll begin to realize that our identity and worth are not defined by success. Now, in Jesus' own ministry, he pretty much burst the disciples' bubble on success. I mean, he would have seemed to have a good thing going, right? He was playing the role of the itinerant teacher. He was helping people, healing people, building his base, expanding his influence. Jesus was well on his way to becoming a successful Messiah, or at least that's what it looked like to the disciples. Jesus asked them who people thought that he was, and some said John the Baptist raised from the dead, and some said that he was the prophet Elijah come back from of old with fire in his words. Some said that he was one of the prophets. But when Jesus put the question directly to Peter, Peter responds, "You are the Christ," or the Messiah. And Peter's right. That is exactly who Jesus is. But before Peter can go and fill out that word with visions of military grandeur, Jesus says that the Messiah is going to suffer many things, be rejected by the chief priests, elders, the teachers of the law, be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And Peter takes him aside, and in verse 32, in the passage that we read, in verse 32, it says Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. And what that means, what that word rebuke means, is that Peter is saying to Jesus, no way. This won't happen to you. You are a good person, Jesus. God loves you. You're on the road to success. And this is when Jesus says those famous, sharp words, get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of man. In other words, Peter is seeking to measure Jesus' ministry with an earthly yardstick. Acclaim, power, money, influence, success. But those are just human ways of looking at the world. And Jesus turns those metrics on their head and points to something different. He says that through his death, God will redeem the world. And if anyone's going to become his disciple, they'll need to take up their cross and follow him. Jesus bursts their bubble, and he bursts it hard. The disciples are urging Jesus on to new heights. Go for gold. But Jesus flips their whole value system around on its head. Go for God. And part of what Jesus is saying is that if the disciples are set on measuring the value of his ministry, the value of his person on worldly success, then he's not going to really measure up. I mean, just think about this. Think about Jesus' own life. He was a small-town prophet. He arrived in Jerusalem, that great city, that holy city, just long enough to turn over a few tables and get on the wrong side of the powers that be. He never argued with the philosophers in Athens. He never preached to the emperor in Rome. And then he's arrested and he's put on a sham trial and he's killed in the worst possible way. And to top it all off, in the moment of his deepest need, his closest friends abandon him. His life does not look like much of a success story according to human calculations. So what Jesus was really doing was trying to adjust the disciples' expectations. Get them to rethink their view of the world. What's success going to look like for God? What's it going to mean for them to follow a Messiah who gets crucified? True, he will be raised in power. True, he's coming again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. But before all of that, there's the road to the cross. Jesus is asking them, are you with me? Will you take up your cross and follow me? You see, Jesus is not going to fulfill their dreams as a Messiah. Jesus is not their life coach. Jesus is not going to help them lead successful lives. Maybe the disciples should have known this. I mean, if they would have thought through the example that they have in the Old Testament, then they might have been able to realize that the God they follow and worship is the God who chooses to save the world, not by the might of emperors and armies, not by economic and military power, but by his Spirit, which happens to be exactly what the prophet Zechariah said long ago. This is the God who let his people be carried away by Babylon, the God who let his temple be destroyed. It's the God who chose Ruth, that young widow, to become the great-great-grandmother of David. This is the God who positioned Esther for such a time as this and who told Gideon, his leader to free his people, to reduce the size of his army. This is the God who defeated an undefeatable giant with a little stone thrown by a little shepherd boy. So yeah, there would have been some clues out there that might have led the disciples to suspect that Jesus was going to turn the world's value system on its head. He was going to use situations and people who might not measure up to the world's metrics of success. He's the Messiah, all right, but the crucified Messiah, the suffering Messiah, the Messiah who gives his life for the life of the world. He's saying to his disciples, are you with me? Because that's the kind of disciple that I'm going to be. That is going to be how I live out my mission. Or will you follow to the cross with me? Will you take up your cross? And Jesus was teaching them in his life, in his words, that his identity and his worth would not be measured and defined by the usual metrics of success. What's more, I think Jesus wanted the disciples to imitate his example. When he told them that they would have to take up their cross and follow him, he was calling them, in part, to die to success. You see, success Success is a very tricky word. I mean, when it comes to living the good and abundant life, how do we measure success? When it comes to discipleship, what does success look like? Because bigger, better, stronger, faster, those things might make sense when we're talking about productivity and sales, but they aren't the best fit when we're trying to measure the kingdom. The measure is faithfulness to Jesus' cross-bearing ways. If you want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. I think there are at least two problems when we apply the language of success to the work of God. The first of these problems is that worldly success can actually mean kingdom failure. So sometimes what looks like success in our eyes looks like failure in God's eyes. So the Lord, after all, looks at the heart. Success in the world's eyes might look like failure in God's eyes. And I think about the huge Willow Creek Church outside of Chicago. They got 26,000 attendees across 3 services on any given weekend. They host conferences that attract thousands of leaders who want to learn their techniques. They got these churches affiliated with them who are actively trying to implement their model around the country. They've got a Spanish-speaking ministry. They've got a publishing arm that produces many helpful books and other resources. I've read some of them. That sure sounds successful. But back in 2008, the church did a self-study, and they found that of their new attendees, people who were new to the church that they had attracted, many of those people who described themselves as close to Christ felt stalled, were considering changing churches. And the picture that emerged out of that study was of a congregation that was able to draw a huge crowd, but that was not always forming those people for a deeper walk with Christ. Not that our smaller churches are always doing much better, but that's what they discovered at Willow Creek. And I think the reality is that what looked like a success, numbers, influence, money, was not as successful on God's kingdom terms. You know, the same thing can happen in our individual lives. A person can have it all: the great job, good health, supportive spouse, perfect children, wonderful friends who provide him with sparkling conversation, all the outward trappings of success, and still not have what matters most. This is probably why so often very rich and famous people make such a mess of their lives. I mean, outwardly they are successful, but inwardly they're longing for something deeper, what philosopher Charles Taylor called fullness. All of us are carrying around within ourselves that sense that we were created for something beyond this world, that the horizons of life should go deeper rather than just bigger and better. And I think it's that longing within us, that disquiet within us, that hunger in us for something beyond ourselves that Jesus is trying to point us toward, to get us to activate, to follow him. I think of Augustine, this 5th century theologian and priest and writer. I love Augustine. Augustine lived the life that he always wanted. His life went just like the script that he wanted for himself, but he still found himself longing for something deeper. He grew up in a provincial city in North Africa. He went on to Rome and then to Milan, the centers of imperial power and education. He had the idea that he would get an education and make a name for himself. He was going to strike it big, and he did. But along the way, he discovers the gospel, and he meets Jesus. And he finds that the longing in his heart will never be satisfied by the trappings of worldly success. Now, Augustine's journey does not end there. He doesn't just get converted to God and then voila, all is well. He's perfectly content and satisfied. If anything, in that moment of conversion, and it's really kind of a slow motion conversion for him, but if anything, in that conversion to Christ that he experiences, Augustine is more uncomfortable in his own skin because he starts to realize how his whole life had been oriented towards that which does not satisfy. And so then he begins this struggle, this painful struggle of reorienting his life toward God. And along the way, He starts to die to worldly visions of success, and he begins to live toward a new life in Christ. Now, the second problem with this language of success is that sometimes what looks like the opposite of success, what looks like failure, can lead through to God's success. Think about the Apostle Peter, the one that Jesus said he was going to build his church on. And there in that moment of trial, Peter fails, right? He denies Jesus 3 times. That is not really the most promising beginning for the church when your key leader denies Jesus 3 times. But Peter goes on to faithfully lead the church as it grows and spreads throughout the Roman world. What looked like failure led through to God's success. Or I think about the Mesorita Christos Church in Ethiopia that was founded by Mennonite missionaries back in the 1950s. Now, in 1974, the traditional emperor of Ethiopia was overthrown, and an atheist Marxist government called the Derg swept into power. And that government, the Derg, they made it illegal for young people, for people under 30, to attend church. And then they started to arrest church leaders. Then they made it illegal for churches to meet. Then they confiscated church property. And the Mesorita Christos Church numbered around 5,000 members when this persecution began, and the missionaries had to leave the country, and things kind of seemed to go dark. Nobody could preach a Billy Graham revival. There was not even the possibility of worshiping openly. You know, taking away the church's property and leadership and young people is not exactly a recipe for success. And for 10 years, the church was underground. And when religious restrictions were finally lifted and the church began to meet again, the leaders got together and looked around and found that their church had grown to 34,000 members in that time period. And the church has continued to grow. New leaders are being trained. Their evangelistic work is expanding. And what looked like a failure in the eyes of the world, God used to grow the kingdom. I think we have to die to success and recognize that our identity and worth are not defined by success. And honestly, half the time, we don't even know what we're talking about when we talk about success. Writer and pastor Tim Suttle says that success is the kind of metric we simply don't know how to handle. It's above our pay grade. We see far too little of the big picture to worry about success, so we need to talk about it much less than we do. The things that we take most pride in life aren't always going to be the things that lead through to abiding satisfaction and sense of identity. Our hearts are restless until we rest in God. Now, the funny thing is that when we've begun to die to success and really walk the way of the cross with Jesus, we start to get to a place where we're safe with success. When we find our identity in God, there's a way in which we're able to do well and strive and be ambitious and succeed, but not have those things define us. We don't lose sight of what matters most. We get this holy ambition that is not deterred by what looks like failure and also does not idolize what looks like success. We become like the Apostle Paul, who had bragging rights to starting thriving churches and preaching the gospel all around the Mediterranean, but who instead says, "May I never boast of anything except the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ." I think it's a mark of spiritual maturity when we're able to say, I've accomplished these things. I've done these things. I'm proud of this. But let me tell you about what matters most. I've lived as a disciple of Jesus. I think when we get to that moment, we'll have this fire in our bellies for excellence. We'll be able to strive for God's work in everything that we do. We'll achieve, struggle, thrive, but we'll release those outcomes to God. We'll hold success lightly, and we'll define ourselves as disciples rather than achievers. When we're able to do that, I think we're starting to get at the heart of what Jesus meant when he said, whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. Amen.